So, Franz, thanks so much for joining the Paesanos podcast. I really enjoy having you on
My
today.
pleasure, Sean. Thanks for having me.
So, I wanted to talk with you as an artist, a musician, a writer, and sort of everything that you've got going on in the world of creativity. First and foremost, with the role of the internet, that's sort of played throughout your career. Obviously, the internet today is different than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And so I guess let's just start there and sort of ask how the process has changed for you when it comes to creating, writing, songwriting, and even sort of putting stuff out into the world now versus when you first kind of started your career.
Sure. So I've been in the music business for 25 years, which means I've basically seen the entire history of of music on on the internet from the very beginnings. I mean, I remember when I was it must have been late college or my early post collegiate years. And I was making my own music, and for the original GarageBand.com opened up, and this was the first. I don't know if you remember this. This was the first place where you could sort of upload songs and have them get them critiqued by strangers.
Yeah.
And what a revelation that was in terms of people who aren't my friends are going to hear these songs that I wrote and recorded and have an opinion on them.
Yeah.
Obviously, Napster, 99, 2000. At that point, I wasn't, I was much more weighted on the side of being a music fan than being an active participant in the music industry. So that was pretty exciting, especially, that was the dot-com boom. I was living in New York, so I had a job at a dot-com, had, reasonably fast internet by the standards of 1999 at work. And a CD burner, so that was pretty exciting too. MySpace as someone who was in bands in the early 2000s was in a lot of ways remains the best sort of community building experience for bands for a couple years there, in terms of being in touch. That was the first time where you could really feel like you could contact the people who were fans of your band directly, or be in contact with them to the extent that you wanted to. But in terms of booking shows and sort of on the DIY level, being part of a network of bands and promoters and people who were putting on shows and fans. The ability to access, I mean, the biggest plus that's sort of maintained through that is independent distribution, the ability to sell your music, distribute your music, stream your music, get your music on the streaming platforms for a nominal fee through various websites. I want to give a shout out to CD Baby, who are probably stuck with a name that they wish they hadn't started with in the aughts, but for my money, remain the most artist friendly company for that sort of thing, in terms of now digital, then physical distribution, now digital distribution. Bandcamp obviously has been great for people. So, on the one hand, on the other hand, right, the internet giveth and the internet taketh away.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to hear you talk about like Napster, and I remember LimeWire, and those it took work to really like burn a CD and put that playlist together, similar to how it was, making a mixtape or whatever before that. But the free access to music, I know, was a big problem for the industry, and they've done everything to make sure that that's not possible anymore.
Well, they haven't done that much. I mean, the damage was done, right? So the revenues of the music industry between 2000 and by the time Napster was shut down have literally halved, and they made up some of that on when in the advent of iTunes a few years later. And then streaming, but it's never completely recovered. And the I mean, Spotify is one of those companies. I think like we understand on some level that Amazon is bad for the world and that Uber is bad for the world, but but
Mhm.
people have sort of made their um, um, it's just too convenient. And so people are just
Right.
willing to live with that knowledge. And Spotify is one of those companies. You know, Spotify was built on torrenting technology. The original Spotify library was built on the pirated music collections of the founders of Spotify. And they've maintained that sort of attitude. They're not fundamentally interested in music as such. They're interested in um, monopolizing the audio listening lives of their users. And what they've managed to do, you know, and it's really stark from a music fan's point of view. Obviously, it's incredible. You have uh, as close to a universal library. Obviously, it's not a universal library, but
Mhm.
it's closer than the world has ever come. And that is great for the music fan. It's great for the up and coming musician who has access to all this. You know, they can put all this stuff in their ears in the way that someone my age never could have. Um, on the other hand, you know, they've eliminated the last vestiges of people paying directly for music, right? So
Mhm.
iTunes, with the iTunes Music Store, and to some extent Bandcamp, was a little bit of clawing that back for a few years in terms of paying a nominal fee, $1 a song, um, for recorded music, and then streaming music has completely, you know, more or less eliminated that. And so, you know,
Mhm.
on the ground for a musician, what do you do? You know, when I started touring in the aughts and then through the early teens, the big revenue source on tour was selling CDs. And
Mhm.
CDs were a pretty good profit margin. You could make them for $1 and sell them for $10. Um, and nobody's buying CDs, and nobody's buying. Very few people are buying MP3s.
Mhm.
And then, so from the point of view of the touring musician, what are you selling? Not, you know, the critical mass of people who have turntables is not large. And from a logistical point of view, LPs are large, they're bulky, um, especially if you're doing international touring. You simply can't bring enough to stock your entire tour. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and so, just in terms of like someone went to your show, they liked what they heard. What do you have to offer them?
Mhm.
It's a real conundrum.
Yeah.
You're in the dry goods business, um, in terms of trying to find a thing that's broadly of interest to anyone who might come to that might come to a show, and they're just we haven't been able to replace that.
What about making the music specifically? I mean, I know I saw you with the Hold Steady at the last Massive Nights series in Brooklyn there, and as part of that, you know, you guys do sort of sound check and talk and share things, and you talked a lot about the process, the songwriting process, and sort of uploading files to Dropbox and listening to those and throwing feedback, you know, in a Google Doc or whatever. Obviously that process is so much different than getting a group together physically and bringing your ideas into the room. What is that like? I mean, where you're literally songwriting across a virtual connection.
Yeah, I mean that's has really was really accelerated by the pandemic. I know that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
musicians I know um, took took that opportunity to really upgrade their home studio situation, home recording situation.
Mm-hmm.
People bought nicer microphones. People learned how to use the software that they had maybe half learned. Um, you know, it was really only a month or two into the pandemic before I started fielding emails from people being like, "Hey, I'm making this record. Can I send you some
Yeah.
files?" Like, yeah, absolutely. Sitting around, you
Yeah.
know.
Right. Right.
You know, a lot of people made pandemic home records. The Hold Steady had already sort of started working that way because at the time I was living in California. Steve, one of our guitar players, lives in Memphis, and so when we started writing music again in 2017, it just made sense for us to be, at least in the early stages, of sending instrumental tracks to Craig, the singer, to be building them up a little bit at home and sharing them that way.
Hmm.
Although at that point, it was usually very much, one of us would make a very rough demo. Craig might sing over it, and then we would get together in a room. In the pandemic era and beyond, it's been much more of um, filling out relatively complete demos before we get in a room. And it's
Hmm.
you know, we have the benefit of doing that because we're musicians with 20 years of experience working with each other.
Yeah.
We have that chemistry and understanding of what everyone needs and wants. I think it might be harder I to be starting from scratch with people. I'm not sure, but you can't beat that convenience. There are upsides and downsides. I have feel like that it gives you an opportunity to do a sort of proof of concept demo.
Hmm.
I remember in the early years of that band, sometimes I would bring in music, and it would be a little hard to, sometimes you bring in music and it's obvious to everyone in the room how it's going to go and what they're going to play, and sometimes it's not, and it's not always
Yeah.
easy to explain how you're hearing it in person in the moment.
Sure.
Um, so working from home gives you the opportunity to sort of fill out the sound and not be prescriptive about it, but to say, here's how I imagine that it might look and
Yep.
sound.
Yep.
And then people can sort of wrap their heads around it in advance of getting in a room together. And obviously, then it goes through the filter of the specific musicians. And when it comes out the other side, even if it doesn't go in sounding like a Hold Steady song, it comes out sounding like a Hold Steady song.
Of course.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's a benefit. The downside is that I think that prescriptiveness, where if you send around a very full sounding demo, it can be harder for people to put their own stamp on it, or
Hmm.
to come at it with really open ears in terms of what their part might be.
Hmm.
Um, and you try to balance that in all kinds of ways. I think sometimes I've erred on the side of sending too complete an arrangement, which I've tried to pull back from. Tad, one of our other guitar players, is pretty good about sending um, very sketchy demos in many cases, which gives us a lot of room to play with.
Yeah.
um, Although that's not always the case, he can send very full band arrangements too. He's actually a really good drummer, so particularly in
Oh,
that
interesting.
sense, the drum parts can be pretty well filled out. Um, So I don't know.
Would you
That's one of
consider?
those sort of the needle waves back and forth. But it for a band where not everybody lives in the same area, or people have families. We're not when the band started. We were rehearsing twice a week for 2 or 3 hours a time, and we could
Hmm.
really write in the practice room. And we just don't have that kind of flexibility in our lives now. So the
Yeah.
Dropbox writing works for
Kind of.
that.
Yeah, and kind of nice that you don't even really need it to be. I mean, considering that you've got the 20 years of experience there working together, and the very fast upload speeds and things now that weren't around at the advent of the band.
Yeah, I mean, I
Um,
would say sometimes I would like to have a little more rehearsal time before we go into the studio. These last three
hmm.
records, we get these demos, and then we're we're really only in the rehearsal space for a day or two, playing these songs for the very first time before we're in the studio, which on the one hand maybe captures the discovery process of the song. On the other
Hmm.
hand, we definitely have had that experience of making the record and never having played the song really as a band.
Sure.
And then we
Yeah.
very quickly discover we settle into something else in a live version where we're like, oh, that's how I should have played it. But
Yeah.
that is what it is.
So you guys put out an album, Open Door Policy, in 2020, which had been worked on pre-pandemic, but then you're in the process of releasing an album during that time, and eventually touring it to some degree with nobody in the room, no fans in the room with
Yeah.
you. I can talk all day about what that meant to me as a fan, and what that experience was like watching virtually, seeing you guys on stage and different cities and places around the world. But what was that experience like, live streaming a show with nobody in the audience, and seeing maybe faces on televisions or getting a little bit of feedback here and there, but essentially just relying on that virtual connection?
Yeah, I mean, it was very surreal and very emotional, as you can imagine. I remember having a very emotional reaction just to seeing um, crew people on the stage, like setting up the stage, just being like, wow, it's people who are good at what they do doing the thing that they do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what a great thing. Um, it was a little bit like the experience of being on late night television, where you're there. In those cases, there's maybe 100 people in the room, but you can't really see them. They're 20 yards away. They're behind really bright lights and a lot of cameras,
Mm-hmm.
and so you're sort of shutting that out and acting as if uh,
Sure.
you sort of make a mental image of a few thousand people and play to
Mm-hmm.
that mental image. And so playing to an empty room at the Brooklyn Bowl, for example, was a little bit like that. We had these TV screens around the sides and the back of the room that was showing people's Zoom faces, and that was really great to see. That helped, although I did find after a couple songs that it was extremely distracting and that I was missing my mark, so I had to really uh, block that out. Um, but then, and we've talked about this before, at the end, when, the guitar feedback was still going and had looped, and we were all sort of sitting over by the bowling alleys looking at the screens, and the director was flipping through and people were holding up messages. That was a really emotional moment.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was on both sides of the screen. I could say, being able to have some access to the music in that way was something a lot of us really needed at that time. Would you consider New River a pandemic album, or was it the pandemic that just kind of made it possible to finally put out into the world?
Yeah, that's what it was. I mean, I was
Okay.
um, again, April of 2020, sitting around
Yeah.
trying to figure out what to do with my nights after the kids went to bed, and I had a couple fully formed songs that I'd written over the previous couple of years. I hadn't put out a record since 2015. I had a lot of music instrumentals. Some of them were stuff that, for whatever reason, hadn't made the cut as a Hold Steady song, but that I still thought were good. I have a huge slush pile of words, some of which becomes lyrics, some of which becomes fiction, or writing prose of various kinds. And
Mhm.
so I stayed up for a week or two, just marrying the two together, and pretty quickly had a 10 or 11 songs that were ready to go. And then, of course, I had to wait another
Mhm.
year to
Yeah.
record them, to get people in the room to record
Sure.
them.
And I know you've talked about this before, but you're a guy who likes to release vinyl as well, and that wasn't too easy to do at the time either. I
I
understand.
mean, honestly, I don't give a shit how it comes out.
Okay.
Um, and I'm not like a vinyl fetishist or anything. I want the music to get out there in whatever form the most people are gonna hear it. And honestly, after that experience, I don't think I'm gonna prioritize vinyl going forward, because
Interesting.
I mean, that was a particularly bad couple of years in terms of the turnaround on vinyl, for a variety of
Hmm.
structural reasons, which we don't need to get into. But uh, yeah, I mean, I wrote the songs in April 2020. I couldn't get people in a room to record them until a year later, spring of 21, and then it took another year and a half to get the vinyl made. And so by that point, you're just like, well, this is old news. It's really
Yeah.
frustrating.
Yeah. Sure.
Um, so yeah, I'm not particular, but from the label point of view, vinyl is where they are making their money back. Um,
Hmm.
and so there's, from their point of view, you have to wait till you have something you can sell, which makes total sense to me. But I will say that the most exciting feeling that I've had in terms of releasing music in the last several years is those couple of years where the Hold Steady was recording and then putting the songs up on Bandcamp a few months later. Um, just because the turnaround was so quick, I
Hmm.
feel like we're not taking enough advantage of what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation. The convenience of distribution. And I understand why not, but in terms of like the immediacy of like, hey, we wrote and recorded this song, and we want people to hear it. Um, you have the opportunity, not that this happens all the time, but in theory, you could write a song in the afternoon, in the morning, record it in the afternoon and
Yeah.
have people hearing it that night.
Yeah.
And I wish that happened more often because that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and you could really bring people along with the process as well. You're talking about, recording it one way and then ultimately playing it live and wishing, I wish I did this. There's the possibility of bringing people along in that process, even if you release it one way and it changes a little bit a month later. I don't know what all that looks like necessarily, but love that idea, that bad Bandcamp structure you talked about of, writing things and releasing them as soon as they're ready, is pretty
I will
unique.
say that from the band point of view, uh, there is a way in which it was exciting for us to do that, but people don't take it as seriously. You get sort of caught
Hmm.
between a catch-22, uh, of which uh, um, we released an album's worth of material, but no one uh, is going to treat it as an album until you release it all at once. Uh,
Sure.
so during those 2 years, the question we kept getting in those soundcheck parties and elsewhere was, when are you going to compile this stuff? When are you going to put it all together? We're like, okay, I guess people want us to compile it and put it all together. And then when we did that, the reaction was like, well, this is not a real album. We heard all these songs before. It's like, well, fuck,
Yeah. You could have
what do you
compiled
want
it.
from us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate you doing that, and truly, I mean, it is a totally different lens into the process and into how stuff gets released, and the immediacy of it is pretty
Yeah.
neat.
I mean, and
Um,
also, I will say that if you're not paying it very close, that's like a Hold Steady super fan reaction. So there's a whole
sure,
chunk of people who didn't even know, because media outlets are not going to cover you releasing songs on Bandcamp. So
sure.
from that point of view, there were X thousands of other people who were like, "Wow, Hold Steady record. We've never heard this stuff before. This is super
Yeah,
cool." And so that's the argument for compiling this stuff or for saving it up until and doing a proper album release.
yeah,
But
yeah.
an album release in this day and age is going to be songs that you wrote a, a year plus earlier, or in the case of
Hmm.
Price of Progress, the album's coming out in 2023, songs we started writing in 2020, and that feels like too
Hmm.
long.
I want to switch topics a little bit because I know that you've been working for well over a year now, unfortunately, with the Ukrainian music scene. And as the war has forged on there, I want to ask about what that looks like today. What is the music scene like in Ukraine, or what are the artists up to? What are you up to as it relates to the efforts there?
Um, I mean, I can't really speak to the entirety of the Ukrainian music scene.
Sure, sure.
Normal life continues apace in a lot of the country, especially the western half of the country. People are playing shows, people are recording. A lot of people are in the army or in the territorial defense militias. So that's um, disruptive to being in a
Mhm.
band,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
There a lot of people have emigrated, particularly to Germany and to Poland. Um, I can't speak in granular detail. Um,
Well, and maybe I should back up a little bit too for people who don't necessarily know. I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, when the war broke out, you leapt into action trying to help with connections and funding. Do I is that
well, I mean, in this only in the sense that a lot of people did. You know, my family has connections to Ukraine maybe than the average American. My wife is
Mhm.
Ukrainian American, and she has relatives living there, and she's an academic whose research is based in Ukraine, and we've spent extended periods of time living there. And
okay?
so, um, you know, there was a period of trying to figure out, can we take people in here? What's the visa situation? Who's, um, should we go to the Polish border and try to facilitate there? What's the best things we can do? Um,
Hmm.
Spin asked me to write an article about the Ukrainian music scene, so I did leap into action in terms of that,
Hmm.
raising awareness. And Craig and I played that fundraiser that Eugene Hoots put together, who's a guy I've known for a
Yeah.
long time. Um, you know, as the full scale invasion has become more normalized, um, it's unfortunately it's less dramatic in many ways. Um,
Hmm.
but um, I don't know. We're still in touch with a lot of people there. Again, Maria has been really involved in terms of raising awareness and talking about Ukrainian music, and talking about particularly this ongoing argument about Russian cultural hegemony and Russian cultural colonialism and imperialism,
Hmm.
um, which remains a fraught issue. Um,
Is that, I mean, that feels really front and center even today. Elizabeth Gilbert just postponed indefinitely the release of her book, which kind of does exactly what you just described in terms of Russian culture. Talking about 1970s Soviet infrastructure, and I mean, what are your thoughts on that sort of creative venture and the way it's playing out
Sure. I
today?
mean, I can't speak to Elizabeth Gilbert specifically because I
Yeah.
only saw the headline go by, and I haven't read the specifics. But I will say that I think the conversation gets really simplified in the headlines to, oh, they're canceling Tchaikovsky and Pushkin. And it's like, no, it's not that.
Yeah.
But it is about the ways in which the nature of colonialism and imperialism is that cultures get subsumed into the hegemonic culture, right? So, for
Mhm.
example, Adam Curtis put out this documentary on the BBC a few months ago, which is a really extraordinary thing. It's based on footage that they found in a BBC closet I think, in Moscow, of um, just tons and tons of documentary footage from across the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1999. So the fall of communism and the reconstruction in the 90s.
Mhm.
And the headline, and it's a 7 hour documentary, seven hour long sections. And at the top of every hour, it says Russia. It says this is Russia, but the footage is
Mhm.
from not just Russia, but Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine, Chechnya, um,
Sure.
Tajikistan. But to frame it as Russia is, even from a basically well-meaning, artist of the left like Curtis, is is really misleading and feeds into this the Russian chauvinist position that all of these countries and cultures and nations are to some extent Russia.
Mhm.
And it was really, and I watched all 7 hours and I really admired it and I was glad I did. But it was really shocking that someone in 2023 would say all of this footage is Russia, and all of these experiences of the fall of communism are subsumed into and subservient to the experience of Russia. And so
Hmm.
that's what the conversation and the resetting of the meter is about in this past year, is saying, um, you know what, maybe, obviously, yes, okay, so there are, uh, Russian intelligentsia, Russian cultural refugees, the experience of being, maybe you're a liberal writer who doesn't feel safe in Russia anymore and you've emigrated. Um, but is that and that's a really difficult position to be in. But is that a more difficult position to be in than the Ukrainian writer, the Ukrainian musician, whose whose culture has not been celebrated on the international stage for centuries,
Hmm.
and whose nation is trying to be wiped out? Um,
Yeah.
I let me put it this way. Um, my family and I were traveling a few years ago, and we went to, I forget what country we were in, but we were at an Iraqi restaurant. It was run by Iraqi refugees, and they were very nice to us. But it felt like a very, we went there. We wanted to, but it felt extremely awkward and embarrassing to be an American eating at an Iraqi restaurant, even an American who didn't who protested against the Iraq War, who
Hmm.
was by no means a supporter of the American government in many of its international escapades in the
Yeah.
last 20 years. You still have to answer for it. And
Yeah.
so I'm not entirely sympathetic to the position of Russian cultural figures, dissident figures, refugee figures, whose argument is we are as much of a victim as this situation as
Sure.
our Ukrainian equivalent figures are, because that's just simply not the case. And it's not
Well, and
fair, but it may not be fair, but it's not the case.
yep.
And so to the extent that an opera company thinks twice about staging Eugene Onegin for the umpteenth time, and thinks about maybe there's repertoire from Ukrainian composers that we might program instead. I don't think that's an unfair position to take.
Totally. And I appreciate that, there's all of this is complex, and you do a lot of deep thinking around all the work that you do, all the creativity that you put out into the world. And I appreciate being able to ask you, about a lot of these things. And you write about so much, whether it's in fiction, nonfiction work that you've put out in the world, in the articles you've written, obviously, in the music and all the different bands that you're part of. And how do you prioritize that? How do you decide what's the next thing you're working on? Is it just sort of what's in front of you, or what's that day to day like for you as you're considering what's the next most important thing for you to work
Yeah,
on?
it's really tricky. I mean, there's a way in which, um, for most of my young adult life, I really was working on a lot. I had a lot of plates in the air. And then when I became a parent, one of the adjustments was realizing that I could only have one major project aside from aside from raising the kids,
Yeah,
that I could be working
the
on
other
at a
major
time.
project there.
So there's a way in which I'm still working through the backlog from 10 years ago in terms of stuff that I had started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, um, it's my daughter's 10th birthday today as we're recording this, and
Oh,
what
that's
I'm
great.
working on is cutting down the manuscript of a book that I started working on in 2015. Um,
Hmm.
so a book that I started, she was 2, but maybe I still hadn't quite come to that realization yet. So that's why I'm saying that maybe there's a way in which I'm still working through that backlog, and I think once I get this manuscript off my desk, that'll be the first time maybe in that decade where when I finish that project, I'll have a clean slate in terms of what's the next project going to be. I mean, I already know what it's
Hmm.
going to be, probably, but I think, I want to balance the music stuff and the writing stuff. I want to balance the hold steady stuff and this and whatever I'm working on independently of the hold steady. Um,
Hmm.
Things present it all sort of sorts itself out. I don't know. Things present themselves in terms of freelance
Sure.
work. A band will or an artist will email me and say, "Hey, I want you to play on my record, and here's so many tracks, and they're going to pay me." So that jumps to the front of the line.
Yep. Yep.
Um, Hold steady stuff is booked, a year in advance, or at least I know sort of roughly what's coming up. I have my teaching jobs, so that um, I know when my classes are going to be. I know that I have a day or two a week where I can work on other things. Um, it's just scheduling conflict, but in terms of the main projects, I'm just trying to alternate. New
Sure.
River came out, my solo record, last year, so that takes care of that for a couple of years. I have to finish. The thing before that was my novel, Someone Should Pay for Your Pain.
Hmm.
So in terms of alternating between writing and music, I know that the next thing up should probably be the next book, which is
Hmm.
convenient because
Sure.
that's the thing on my desk. So once I get that off my desk, then I'll probably think about is the next musical project, do I want it to be another solo record of songs with lyrics, or do I want it to be another sort of instrumental art music project?
Yep. Yep.
Um, I know that the next writing project is should be another novel in terms of the rotation, and also will be another novel in terms of that's what I have the idea for and the pages for.
Yep.
It sort of works like that.
Yeah. And I mean, as long as we're looking to the future too, and thinking about the world that your kids are growing up in, what does have you put any thought into like how that continues to evolve the process of writing and releasing books and music and articles, the existentialism of artificial intelligence and its role in all of this stuff? I mean, do you think about that? Do you think about ways that you could maybe use it in the work that you're doing, or is it just kind of out there and you've got your process and they'll eventually have theirs?
AI, I don't know or care about.
Sure.
I really
Fair.
don't. It has nothing to do with what I do.
That's fair.
Um, and I don't know. These things will sort themselves out. It doesn't seem like it's that sort of thing is going to be useful. I, I
Yeah.
people are
I mean,
people are
yeah, like
well,
I think it just puts the human work even more at a premium, to be honest.
yeah. It
The
seems like a thing that a tech panic. Before that it was crypto. Before that it was whatever.
yeah,
The metaverse. These things come and go, and they don't make a splash. And the same sort of people get excited about them, and the same sort of people freak out about them. And I don't understand them, or nor am I interested in them. And so I can go on and do my own thing.
yeah,
I teach at the college level, so at the beginning of the year, we got a flurry of emails from various people being like, you know, chat GPT in the classroom. Here's how you should, watch out for students writing their essays with it, or here's how you incorporate it, or here's how you use it as a teaching exercise. And it's just like, I don't know. Teaching is, I have my lesson plan, and it's hard enough without thinking about that. And the students are going to be more knowledgeable and savvy about it than I am.
yeah,
If they are using, I happen to think that most of them are earnest about learning, and so are going to legitimately try to be writing their essays. And
yeah.
if there's one that isn't, that's the problem. That's a problem for that student and not me.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation in an earlier episode, and the guest brought up the Wreath lectures and Stuart Russell. I don't know if you're familiar with those,
No.
and the BBC puts them on every year. It's a series of lectures, and Stuart Russell talked about artificial intelligence. This is a guy who's spent most of his life studying it, and he's not a panic-stricken techie, and so that gives me a little bit of hope. And I just wondered if you thought about it in terms of writing or songwriting or just sort of in general.
I don't
But
think about it at all.
yeah, great. Love that. Good, good. Well, you know, there's every year you put your annual audio yearbook out there. Any sort of sneak preview or anyone that we should be paying attention to that might end up on the list this
Oh
year?
my God. I already have 150 songs on it, and it's only halfway through the
Great.
year. So it's going to be a real
Awesome.
problem to cut down. What have I been? I've been on a real Sondheim kick for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Stephen Sondheim, the musical theater composer.
Yeah.
I feel like people probably assumed I was much more of a musical theater head than I have been for most of my life. I think mostly because
Yeah.
of the way I sing, which is sort of theatrical, but it wasn't
Sure.
about musical theater. It was just about I just sing that way, and I liked because I grew up singing along to Mark Eitzel and Scott Walker and people like that. Um,
Yeah.
but I think now I'm legitimately I've got the bug. I'm in a
Yeah.
deep Sondheim dive. There's a podcast called Putting It Together that goes through his songs one by one. It's like an hour conversation on each, and I'm like, hundreds of hours into it at that point. At this point,
Good to know.
which I understand is not for everybody, but that's where I am.
Love it.
I don't know, Terry Adams solo records. I've listened to a bunch of the keyboardist from NRBQ.
Okay.
Those. What else did I like? I liked the White Reaper record. There's a from the rock side. I checked out Sheer Mag for the first time. That was a lot of fun. There's a group up here called Bat Fangs. It's a Don Giovanni band. It's these two women, Betsy from X Hex. They do real like sort of classic rock throwback stuff. They're a lot of fun.
Cool.
That's off the top of my head. That's some stuff I've been
Yeah, no,
listening
I
to.
appreciate it. I'm excited, yeah, to dig into some of that stuff. And I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. And we'll let people know to just kind of follow you around. You said at Franz Nicolay everywhere on social media, and of course franznicolay.com, your website. Anything else that you want to share or add while we're here?
At Franz Nicolay, not everywhere. I downloaded TikTok once for about 20
No
minutes,
TikTok.
and I was like, "This is clearly not for me," and deleted it.
Yeah.
I think, at 45, I'm not in the market for new social media outlets. So
A few more hours of Sondheim podcasts, and I
only
think
the
you'll
old
be
guard social media, and as
that's
those
fair.
disappear, so will my social media presence in the
Yes.
decades going forward.
At Franz Nicolay on MySpace.
Yeah, there you go.
We got it. Perfect.
Friendster. I was never on
That's right.
Friendster, actually. I was a late adopter of most of these things.
Yeah.
Anyway, franznicolay.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Franz.
Okay, thanks, Sean.